The envelope was sitting on the floor of the elevator when Harriet Boadu found it. Not tucked against the wall, not forgotten on the handrail, just lying flat in the center of the floor like someone had placed it there on purpose. A cream-colored envelope, the kind that comes with a greeting card, sealed shut and thick, with what felt like folded inside. No name on the front, no return address, nothing. Harriet almost stepped over it. She had been on her feet since 5 that morning. Her lower back had been sending her small, polite warnings since noon, and now, at 7:20 in the evening, those warnings had stopped being polite. She was 53 years old. She was tired. The elevator in the Carlton Grand, the hotel where she had worked as a housekeeping supervisor for 11 years, opened on the lobby floor, and all she wanted to do was clock out, take the bus home to Canada, eat something warm, and sleep. But she picked it up. She didn't open it. She just carried it to the front desk and set it down in front of the night clerk, a young man named Dylan, who was barely 22 and always looked mildly startled by everything. "Found this in the elevator," she said. "Elevator 2, going down. Log it in." Dylan logged it in. Harriet clocked out. She went home. That should have been the end of it. Here is what you need to understand about Harriet Boadu before anything else. She had spent the better part of her adult life making herself useful to people who did not particularly notice her doing it. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't know her own worth, but because she had grown up watching her mother do the same thing, quietly competent, quietly necessary, quietly indispensable, and she had absorbed the lesson so thoroughly it had become her posture, her default, her way of moving through rooms. She had come to Canada from Ghana at 26 with her then-husband, a nursing degree she couldn't get recognized fast enough, and a daughter named Abina, who was 3 years old and already had opinions about everything. The nursing credentials eventually came through. The marriage did not. She had raised Abina alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Nepean, working double shifts when she had to, taking on whatever was available, until she landed the housekeeping job at the Carlton Grand and discovered, to her own surprise, that she was exceptionally good at managing people. She had a way of noticing things, not in a suspicious way, in a careful way. The towel folded wrong. The corridor cart left at an angle that would slow down the next person. The new hires who were trying too hard and the ones who were not trying hard enough. She noticed these things and quietly corrected them, and the floors under her supervision had the lowest complaint rate in the hotel. Her daughter Abina was 30 years old now, a civil engineer working in Calgary, and they spoke every Sunday night without fail. Abina had inherited her mother's directness and added her own layer of impatience to it, which made her very good at her job and occasionally exhausting to talk to about anything personal. Harriet loved her completely and told her so, with a frequency that faintly embarrassed Abina and secretly pleased her. Harriet's apartment in Canada was clean and small and full of plants. She had a cat named Kofi who was old and quiet and sat in the same spot on the windowsill every morning like he was conducting surveillance. She had friends she saw on Saturdays. She had a church she went to twice a month. She had a life that was not glamorous and not unhappy, and she was not, in general, a woman who looked for trouble. Trouble, it turned out, was not looking for her either. It had simply been waiting in an elevator. The envelope came back to her 4 days later. Dylan, the night clerk, had logged it according to protocol and tagged it for the lost and found. The standard procedure at the Carlton Grand was to hold unclaimed items for 30 days. But the envelope had been left in elevator 2 on a Tuesday evening, and by Friday the assistant general manager, a man named Stuart Vance, had received a phone call from a guest's representative asking about it. Stuart Vance was 44 years old and had the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything in a professional context and not having developed the emotional infrastructure to handle it when it finally happened. He was not a bad man. He was, however, a man who had very little curiosity about the people who worked beneath him, which meant he had also very little understanding of them. He called Harriet into his office on Friday afternoon. "You found an envelope in elevator to Tuesday evening," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did." Harriet said. I logged with the front desk. The envelope contained $12,000 in cash. Harriet did not react the way most people would have reacted, which was to inhale sharply or go wide-eyed or say something like $12,000. She just looked at Stuart Vance steadily and said, I didn't open it. I know, he said, but there was something in the word no that did not sound quite like believe. The guest, as it turned out, was a man named Conrad Osei Asante, 61 years old, founder of a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm headquartered in Toronto, with offices in Calgary, Vancouver, and 2 cities in West Africa. He had been staying at the Carlton Grand for a week, as he often did when he had business in Ottawa. He was not, by the standards of the people he did business with, particularly famous. But he was, by any reasonable measure, very wealthy, and he was the kind of wealthy that had learned to travel quietly. The cash, his representative explained, had been withdrawn for a specific purpose and had been left in the envelope by mistake, set down in the elevator while Conrad adjusted something in his bag, and forgotten when the doors opened on his floor. He was grateful it had been turned in. He would like to thank whoever had found it. Stuart Vance passed along Harriet's name. Conrad Osei Asante found her the next morning at 7:15, which was when Harriet started her shift, standing at the housekeeping cart at the end of the 4th-floor corridor doing inventory. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of them being the most important person in most rooms and learning not to need people to confirm it. He was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, no tie. He walked toward her with the unhurried pace of a man who had stopped being in a hurry some years ago. Mrs. Boadu, he said. She turned. She looked at him. He was not a guest she had interacted with directly, but she knew his face from the guest list. She made a habit of reviewing it at the start of each week. Mr. Osei Asante, she said. He seemed mildly pleased that she knew his name. I wanted to thank you in person, he said. That was my carelessness. You could have. Well, you didn't. It wasn't mine to keep, Harriet said. She turned back to the cart and made a note on her clipboard. There was a pause. Just like that, he said. Just like that. He looked at her for a moment. How long have you worked here? 11 years. Doing this? She glanced at him. I'm the housekeeping supervisor for 3 floors, she said. I have 18 people under me. I also still do rounds because I find that's the only way to actually know what's happening. She said it without defensiveness. Just as a fact, Conrad Osei. Asante nodded slowly. He was still watching her with that quiet, measuring quality that she had noticed immediately and was choosing not to be bothered by. I'm going to give you my card, he said. I'd like you to call me. Harriet looked at the card he held out. It was a plain card. Name, number, email, nothing else. She took it. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. She put it in the front pocket of her uniform and went back to her inventory. She did not call him that day. She turned it over on the bus ride home. She was not by nature the kind of person who got swept up in things. She had seen enough of the world to know that when wealthy strangers offered their cards to women like her in hotel corridors, the offer was not always what it appeared to be. She was also not the kind of person who assumed the worst of everyone, because she had seen enough of the world to know that was its own kind of exhausting error. She looked up his name when she got home. Kofi watched her from the windowsill. Conrad Osei Asante was real. His company was real. It had built water treatment infrastructure in 3 Canadian provinces and had a project underway in northern Ontario on land adjacent to a First Nations community. He had given a keynote at a conference in Winnipeg the year before. He appeared twice in a Globe and Mail article about infrastructure investment in underserved communities. He had a son and a daughter. His wife had died 6 years ago. She called him on Sunday evening after she finished talking to Abina. He answered on the second ring like he had been expecting it. I've been thinking about why you gave me your card, she said. I'd like to know what it actually is you're asking. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised and warm. I run a company, he said, and I've spent 30 years watching the people who actually make things work get passed over in favor of people who are better at appearing to make things work. I'm getting old enough that it bothers me more than it used to. He paused. I need someone who can manage operations on a project in Northern Ontario, community, liaison, logistics, staff oversight. It's not glamorous. It's exactly the kind of work you describe doing right now, but at a different scale and with better pay. Harriet was quiet for a moment. You don't know me, she said. I know what you did with that envelope, he said, and I know how you talked to me in that hallway. That's more than I know about most people I hire. She did not say yes immediately. She took 2 weeks. She asked questions about the project, about the team, about what the role would actually require day to day. She asked to speak with someone already on the project, and Conrad arranged it without hesitation. She spoke with a woman named Patience Achampong, who ran site operations and who said, with the particular dryness of someone who has been through things, "He's not easy to work for, but he's honest, which is rarer than it should be." Harriet gave her notice at the Carlton Grand on a Wednesday morning. Stuart Vance received it with a blankness that suggested he had not quite understood that she was someone worth being surprised about losing. She started with Ose Asante Infrastructure Group in March. Now, this is the part of the story where you might expect things to be simple. She found the money, she returned it, she got the opportunity, she took it, and everything worked out. A clean line from one thing to the next. The world does not tend to work that way. The project in Northern Ontario was a wastewater management overhaul for a cluster of 4 communities, 2 of which were First Nations reserves that had been operating with inadequate infrastructure for decades. The work was necessary and overdue and politically complicated and chronically underfunded by the levels of government that should have funded it 30 years ago. The team Harriet was joining had been at it for 18 months and was running behind schedule, over budget in 3 line items, and quietly held together by 4 people who were refusing to admit how tired they were. She arrived in late March. The site was 4 hours north of Sudbury. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by road. The accommodation was a converted modular building that was warm enough and had reliable Wi-Fi and smelled faintly of pine and something industrial she never quite identified. She took 3 days to observe before she said much of anything. She watched how the team moved, who deferred to whom, where the bottlenecks actually were, as opposed to where people thought they were. On the 4th day, she started making lists. Not in a pointed way, not in the way of someone who had arrived with a mandate to fix things, in the way of someone who was going to need to understand the whole picture before she touched any part of it. The project coordinator named Felix Drummond had been at the company for 7 years and had a tendency to run meetings that lasted 90 minutes when 30 would have done it. He was not incompetent. He was someone who had been doing things a particular way for long enough that he had stopped questioning whether the way still made sense. Harriet did not challenge him directly. She started asking, in meetings, specific questions that required specific answers, and within 2 weeks the meetings were running 45 minutes and nobody had commented on it out loud, but everyone had noticed. The relationship with the community liaison on the reserve side was more delicate. The community had been promised things before, by other companies, by government representatives, and the promises had evaporated, and what had been left behind was a residue of distrust that was entirely earned. There was a woman named Josephine Swithhawk who served as the community's point of contact, and who had the specific quality of someone who had learned to be very precise about what she asked for because she had been disappointed by vague agreements too many times. Harriet drove out to meet her on a Tuesday morning in April, alone, without telling Conrad she was going. She did not go with a presentation. She went with a notepad and a thermos of coffee, and she sat across from Josephine Swithhawk in the community center, and she said, "I've read everything that's been documented about this project. I want to know what's not in the documentation." Josephine Swithhawk looked at her for a long moment. Then she poured herself a coffee, and she talked for 2 hours. What came out of those 2 hours was a list of commitments the project team had made, verbally, in passing, in the way that people sometimes make commitments when they are trying to seem cooperative without actually being accountable, that had never been formalized, never been written down, and several of which the team had quietly deprioritized when the schedule tightened. None of it was fraud. Most of it was the ordinary carelessness of people who were overwhelmed and had stopped paying attention to the parts that felt peripheral to the main work. The thing is, the peripheral parts were not peripheral to the people who lived there. Harriet brought what she had learned back to Conrad on a Thursday video call. She did not soften it. "We've made promises we haven't kept," she said. Not because anyone intended to break them, because nobody was tracking them. She went through the list. She told him what she thought it would take to address each one. She told him what it would cost in time and in money, and what the cost would be if they didn't. Conrad listened. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "Do it." Here is the other thing that happened, which is less pleasant but necessary to tell. His name was Martin Gable. He was the senior contracts manager at a subcontracting firm that had been brought in to handle a portion of the electrical work. He was 49, with the ease of a man who had learned that being affable was a good substitute for being trustworthy. And he had been overcharging on materials invoices in small enough increments that the discrepancies had been attributed to supply chain variability and left alone. Harriet found it because she had started doing something nobody had done before, cross-referencing the materials invoices against the delivery logs on a weekly basis, which was exactly the kind of tedious oversight task that everyone knows should happen and that nobody wants to do. The numbers did not match. They didn't match in a pattern. The same category of materials, always the same supplier, always a little high, and always in weeks when the site manager who usually caught these things had been occupied with something else. She brought it to Conrad. He brought it to legal. Martin Gable was removed from the project within a week. The firm he worked for was audited. There was a quiet process that Harriet was not entirely party to, and at the end of it, the overcharges were recovered and the subcontracting arrangement was terminated. What happened to Martin Gable professionally after that, Harriet did not follow closely. She had enough to do. What she did notice was that Felix Drummond, who had initially been slightly formal with her in the way that men of his generation sometimes were with women who arrived with authority they hadn't asked permission for, started routing things through her without being asked. Not dramatically. Just the ordinary small signal of a person recognizing that someone else knows what they're doing. The project delivered its first phase on schedule in November. There was a small ceremony at the community center, and Josephine Swifthawk spoke about what running water that you could trust meant for the people who had gone without it for so long, and several people in the room were crying, including Felix Drummond, who cried in the way of a man who has not been expecting to cry and is not entirely sure what to do about it. Conrad Osi Asante flew up for the ceremony. He sat in the back row, which was not nothing for a man who had built the kind of career that earns you the front row of most things. After, he found Harriet standing outside in the November cold, watching the parking lot empty. "I want to offer you a permanent role," he said, "head of operations, based wherever you want, travel as needed." Harriet looked at the trees. The light was going. In another hour, it would be dark the way it gets dark in northern Ontario in November, which is absolute and thorough and not unkind. "I'd want equity," she said. He looked at her. "What percentage?" "We can negotiate," she said. "But it's not a conversation I'm having from a salaried position. I've spent 30 years making things work for other people. If I'm going to keep doing it, I want to own part of what I'm making work." Conrad Osei Asante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have expected that." "Yes," Harriet said. "You should have." They went back inside. The negotiation took several weeks and involved lawyers on both sides and at least one phone call during which Harriet's daughter Abina, who was visiting for the holidays, sat at the kitchen table listening and intermittently giving her mother a thumbs up from across the room. The agreement was signed in January. On the Sunday evening after the paperwork was finalized, Harriet called Abina. "It's done," she said. "Mom," Abina said, and there was something in her voice that Harriet had not heard often, a softness that Abina did not always allow herself. "I want to say something." "Say it." I know you worked really hard and you were really careful and everything happened for a reason and blah blah blah, Abina said. But also, you picked up an envelope off the floor of an elevator, and that was it. That's what started all of it. Harriet laughed. I know. Doesn't that seem a little ridiculous? Most good things are a little ridiculous when you describe them backwards, Harriet said. Kofi jumped up onto the couch beside her and put his old head on her knee. Outside the window, Canada was cold and dark and February quiet. She had not moved out of the apartment yet. There was time for that later. There was time for a lot of things now. I'm proud of you, Abena said. I just want you to know that. I know you are, Harriet said. I'm proud of me too. And that was the truth, and it was enough, and she meant every word of it.